It was the kind of wedding that no one in town could ignore. In a place where life usually moved at the pace of church bells and porch swings, the sight of Elena and Raymond walking down the aisle was like a thunderclap. People had whispered for weeks, but now, as the doors of the small white church creaked open and the bride stepped inside, those whispers swelled into a collective hush. At 27, Elena should have been radiant, but she was shockingly thin, so frail it seemed the satin of her gown might swallow her whole. Standing nearly 6 feet tall, her bones pressed against the fabric, her arms like twigs clutching a bouquet that looked heavier than she was. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their pews, exchanging quick glances. Some thought she looked ethereal, ghost-like, as if she'd stepped out of a dream or a nightmare. Others murmured about illness, starvation, or darker secrets that might explain her appearance. And then there was Raymond, waiting at the altar. At 42, he was a towering figure, literally. Nearly 6'5" and pushing 500 pounds, his tuxedo groaned at the seams, buttons threatening to burst. Sweat rolled down his temples under the glow of the chandeliers, but his smile was wide, almost triumphant, as if he were daring the congregation to question him. His massive frame dominated the room, making Elena look even smaller, almost doll-like beside him. The contrast was so extreme, so unnatural, it made people stare even when they tried not to. The vows were spoken in voices that barely carried to the back rows. Elena's was little more than a whisper, a tremor slipping through her words. Raymond's was louder, booming, but not tender, more like a declaration of ownership. The preacher's hands trembled slightly as he pronounced them husband and wife, and the applause that followed was hesitant, scattered. In a town where gossip moved faster than Sunday sermons, everyone knew this marriage would be the talk of the year. At the reception, the unease didn't fade. Guests clinked glasses and forced smiles, but the room buzzed with speculation. Some said Elena was chasing money, pointing to the rumors that Raymond owned property and had insurance money tucked away. Others whispered she'd been pressured, or that she wasn't right in the head, recalling sightings of her wandering alone at night, muttering to herself. One guest swore Elena once told her she felt like a skeleton trapped in human skin. Another insisted Raymond had a history, whispers of rough treatment toward women, of controlling behavior hidden behind his charm. Still, the party went on. There was music, there was cake, but there was also a sense that people were watching something fragile about to crack. When Raymond lifted Elena during the first dance, if you could call it that, the sight drew gasps. His arms wrapped around her body like a cage, his size dwarfing hers so completely it looked almost grotesque. Some turned away, embarrassed to keep staring. Others couldn't look anywhere else. Outside, the late summer sun dipped behind the trees, and as dusk settled over the town, the couple finally departed for their wedding night. The limousine door shut with a heavy thud, and as it rolled away, children pressed their faces to the glass of the community hall, waving at a bride who looked like she might vanish if the wind blew too hard. Elena raised a pale hand in return, her face unreadable. Raymond barely acknowledged the crowd, sinking deep into the leather seat like a king in his throne. The streets were quiet after that, but the talk didn't stop. In diners and on porches, people picked apart every detail. The way Elena trembled, the way Raymond grinned too wide, the strange stillness that seemed to hang between them. Some predicted disaster before the honeymoon was over. Others laughed it off, saying love comes in all shapes and sizes, even ones so mismatched it made you uncomfortable to watch. But deep down, most admitted they couldn't shake the chill that had crept into the room when bride and groom stood side by side. By the time night fell, the church was empty, the flowers already wilting in their vases, and the small town settled back into its routine. But something about that wedding clung to people's thoughts like smoke. It wasn't just the odd pairing, the shocking imbalance of size and presence. It was the feeling that beneath the lace and the vows, something darker was waiting to surface. No one knew what would happen once the doors closed on that honeymoon suite. They only knew that the story of Elena and Raymond had begun, and whatever came next, it wasn't going to be ordinary. The hotel, sat on the edge of town, a squat brick building with faded carpets and buzzing neon that promised vacancy 24 hours a day. Couples usually came here for quick weekends, truckers for a night's rest, but rarely for honeymoons. When Raymond and Elena checked in, the clerk behind the counter raised his brows, but said nothing. He slid the key across the counter, watching as Raymond's huge hand swallowed it up, Elena trailing behind him like a shadow. They disappeared down the hallway, and though the lobby returned to silence, the image of them, one massive, the other frail and hollow-eyed, lingered in his mind like a riddle without an answer. Room 212 smelled faintly of bleach and old smoke. The bed sagged in the middle, its headboard dented from years of use. Raymond dropped onto it, the springs groaning in protest, while Elena stood near the window, her veil still clutched in her thin fingers. She hadn't spoken much since the reception, only nodding, only moving when he beckoned. Outside, the parking lot buzzed with insects under the lamps, but inside, the air felt tight, pressing down with an invisible weight. Neighbors in adjoining rooms would later recall muffled noises, a chair scraping across the floor, a heavy thud, the sound of something glass shattering. At first they thought it was just another couple arguing, but then came a sound that made one guest sit upright in bed, a scream, high and sharp, that ended as abruptly as it began. After that, silence fell, the kind that makes you wonder if you imagined it. By 2 a.m, the clerk at the front desk noticed the phone in room 212 had gone off the hook. He tried calling once, twice, but only the hiss of static answered back. By 3, another guest called down, reporting strange noises like furniture breaking. The clerk hesitated. Should he disturb a honeymoon couple? But when the complaints repeated, he finally walked up with a spare key. The hallway was dim, its carpet worn thin in the center. As he approached room 212, he felt a prickle run down his neck. The door was locked from the inside. He knocked, waited. No answer, but he leaned close, and a strange heaviness clung to the air, like the room itself was holding its breath. He called out, voice cracking. Still nothing. His hands trembled as he went back downstairs for the master key and called the police. When officers arrived minutes later, they forced the door open. The scene inside would burn itself into their memories. Raymond lay sprawled across the carpet, his massive body blocking most of the floor. His eyes were open, bulging, his face tinged with a bluish hue. The sheets from the bed had been torn down, tangled beneath him. A lamp lay smashed against the wall. And near the corner of the room, discarded like a ghostly relic, was a white wedding veil soaked through with blood. But Elena was gone. The window stood open a crack, the curtains flapping in the night breeze. Officers leaned out, scanning the parking lot below, but there was no sign of her. The ground was soft from recent rain, yet no clear footprints trailed away. It was as if she had evaporated into the darkness. Detectives swept through the room. They found a half-empty champagne bottle, glasses smeared with lipstick, and on the nightstand, Elena's purse. Inside, along with makeup and receipts, was a small vial of powdery substance later sent to the lab. On Raymond's neck, a deep red mark suggested strangulation, though his size made it nearly impossible to imagine anyone overpowering him. Stranger still, along his shoulder, the examiner noted faint impressions, marks that resembled human teeth. Back in the hallway, the security camera offered one more puzzle. At precisely 3:07 a.m., the grainy footage showed a figure slipping out of room 212. Thin, tall, hair falling loose around her shoulders. Elena, or someone who looked like her. She moved unsteadily, almost gliding, before vanishing down the stairwell. The quality was poor, blurred at the edges, leaving just enough doubt to keep investigators arguing for days. By dawn, word of the scene had already leaked. A guest who had seen the police carry Raymond's enormous body out on a stretcher told anyone who would listen at the diner across the street. By breakfast, the town was buzzing. The wedding everyone had whispered about had turned into something darker, stranger, far more sinister. The skeleton bride was missing. The giant groom was dead, and no one could agree on whether Elena was a victim fleeing in terror or a killer who had just staged her perfect escape. The clerk who had handed them the key earlier sat at his station, pale and shaken. She looked like she was already half gone when they walked in, he muttered. And now, maybe she really is. The news crews would arrive within hours, but the story had already written itself into local legend. The honeymoon suite was sealed off with yellow tape, the faint scent of iron still hanging in the air. Somewhere out there, if she was still alive, Elena was walking alone. Whether she was hunted or hunting, no one could yet say. But the town knew one thing. The wedding night had ended in murder, and the story of the bride who vanished had only just begun. By sunrise, the hotel was a circus. Yellow tape stretched across the second-floor hallway. Officers moved in and out of room 212 with latex gloves snapping, and curious guests clustered at the far end, whispering like they'd stumbled onto the set of a crime drama. The air was heavy with the sour reek of blood and the sterile sting of bleach from the cleaning carts hastily wheeled away. Inside the room, everything felt wrong, like the chaos had frozen in place overnight. Raymond's body consumed the space, his enormous frame sprawled on the carpet, half on his back, half twisted to the side. It took 6 officers just to roll him enough for photographs. His skin, once flushed with heat, had cooled to a bluish gray. His eyes bulged wide, fixed on the ceiling with a look of panic that seemed to scream even in silence. The sheet knotted beneath his chest was streaked with crimson, the fibers stiff and dark, and his massive hands were clenched into fists as if he'd tried to tear something away in his final seconds. Detective Carla Hughes crouched near his head, her notepad already speckled with notes. She'd seen strangulation before, too many times, but never on a man this size. She studied the angry red mark around his neck, not the clean circle of a rope or cord, but more irregular, jagged, as though something had been pulled and twisted against his skin. There were faint abrasions on the sides, like fingernails digging in. Even stranger were the indentations along his shoulder, small, crescent-shaped, unmistakably teeth marks. The medical examiner, Dr. Lane, arrived shortly after. He knelt with a kind of reverence, his gloved hands brushing gently over the bruises. "Cause of death is likely asphyxiation," he murmured. "But look here, these are binding marks. Something thin, flexible. A strap, maybe a belt." He shook his head. "It doesn't make sense. A man this size, 500 pounds, neck as thick as a tree trunk. How could someone like her overpower him?" On the dresser lay fragments of glass from a broken champagne flute, sticky with dried liquid. The carpet was patterned with smudges, one enormous and flat, likely Raymond's. Another much smaller, narrow, toes pointed, as though someone had stepped onto his body to pin him down. Detectives exchanged uneasy glances. It was almost impossible to imagine the frail woman from the wedding photos fighting with such ferocity, yet the evidence painted a violent struggle. Elena's belongings were scattered, her purse half unzipped, lipstick rolling under the bed, a hairpin bent in two. The small vial from her bag had been sealed and sent to the lab. Preliminary tests hinted at toxins, possibly a powerful stimulant or poison, but results would take days. If she had slipped something into Raymond's drink, it might explain why his massive body had failed him so quickly. Meanwhile, the hotel's security footage was reviewed frame by frame. At 2:41 a.m., the camera outside the elevator flickered to life. A figure, tall and unsteady, her frame swaying as if the weight of the gown alone might topple her. The image was blurred, uncanny in the flickering light, the pixels smearing her face into something unrecognizable. She staggered slightly, her arms wrapped around herself as though freezing. At 3:07 a.m., the same camera showed her again, this time moving faster, vanishing through the stairwell door. Whether it was Elena or not, no one could say with certainty. Detective Hughes walked the perimeter outside the hotel. The ground beneath the second-floor window was muddy, but if Elena had escaped that way, the rain had washed away her trail. Still, near the dumpster she found a strange detail, a length of torn fabric, white satin smeared with dirt, and a faint trace of blood. It matched the hem of Elena's gown. Back in the room, Dr. Lane made one more unsettling observation. "See this," he said, pointing at Raymond's lips. A froth of saliva, stained faintly pink, bubbled at the corners of his mouth. That usually signals ingestion of something caustic. Poison, maybe. If she drugged him, he might have been too weak to fight back when she tightened the strap. Theories spread quickly among the investigative team. One camp believed Elena had snapped, using poison to weaken her husband before strangling him. Another wondered if Raymond had collapsed on his own, his heart giving out, and Elena had fled in shock, leaving behind a scene that only looked like murder. But the bite marks were harder to explain. They were deliberate, forceful. It was as if she had wanted to leave a message carved into his flesh. By late morning, reporters crowded the hotel's front steps, shouting questions as the coroner's van rumbled away with Raymond's body. Was it the bride? Is she missing or in custody? What about the poison? Police refused to confirm anything, but inside the tension mounted. The bride's disappearance, the eerie footage, the broken room, it all hinted at a story that was bigger than a domestic quarrel gone wrong. Detective Hughes closed her notebook and stared once more at the white veil lying crumpled in the corner. It was stiff with dried blood, the lace edges shredded, as if it had been ripped off in a struggle. To her, it didn't look like an accident or a fainting bride fleeing tragedy. It looked like a symbol, discarded on purpose, left as a signature. And so the questions only deepened. Had Elena, fragile as she appeared, found a way to kill a man 5 times her weight? Or was there another hand at work, unseen in the chaos of that night? In a town still reeling from the strangest wedding they'd ever witnessed, the honeymoon suite had become a crime scene, and the mystery of the missing bride was just beginning to unfold. Raymond Langley had always been larger than life, long before his weight tipped the scale into the unimaginable. In a town where most men worked modest jobs and lived modest lives, Raymond loomed, physically, financially, and emotionally. At 6'5", with a frame that kept expanding past anyone's comfort zone, he was impossible to ignore. But those who knew him best remembered more than just his size. They remembered the temper, the controlling streak, the way his charm could switch off like a light and reveal something colder underneath. Detective Carla Hughes sat in her office late that evening, digging through the stacks of files pulled from county records. Raymond's name was no stranger to the system. A police report from 2009 detailed an incident with a woman named Marla Jennings, a girlfriend at the time. She had told officers that Raymond had pinned her against a wall during an argument, pressing his bulk down until she couldn't breathe. "He said he could crush me if he wanted," the statement read. Marla never pressed charges, later telling friends she was too afraid. There were other reports too, restraining orders filed, then mysteriously dropped. Another ex-girlfriend claimed he'd stalked her for weeks after she left him, parking his truck outside her house at all hours. A bartender from a roadside tavern remembered breaking up a fight after Raymond shoved a woman to the ground when she tried to walk away. He was big, he was loud, and he knew how to use both to keep people in line. But Raymond had another side, one that made him harder to dismiss as just a brute. He was generous with money, known to pick up tabs at bars, to hand out loans to struggling neighbors. He sponsored the local Little League, paid for a cousin's hospital bills, donated to the church roof fund. People excused his temper because of it. "That's just Raymond," they'd say, shrugging, as if his kindnesses balanced out the shadows that followed him. Financially, he wasn't the mogul imagined, but he had enough. A life insurance payout from his father's death gave him a cushion, and he owned a few rental properties on the edge of town. He didn't need to work much, and when he did, it was odd jobs, hauling, selling used equipment, managing his properties. He had plenty of time to linger at bars, browse dating sites, and cultivate the reputation of a man who could take care of a woman if she was willing to bend to his rules. That was where Elena entered the picture. Investigators traced their first online interactions back to a niche forum, a corner of the internet that catered to extreme fetishes and unusual pairings. Raymond had posted photos of himself, playing up his size as a point of dominance. Elena, already fragile and obsessed with her skeletal appearance, responded. At first it seemed like an unlikely match, two people from opposite extremes of the human spectrum. But their messages hinted at something more toxic, a predator and a victim circling each other, or perhaps two broken pieces drawn together by their damage. Friends of Raymond's weren't surprised he'd married someone half his size. He'd often boasted he needed a woman he could handle, someone who wouldn't talk back. To him, Elena must have seemed perfect, quiet, frail, pliable. But behind closed doors, neighbors heard shouting from his house in the weeks before the wedding. One reported seeing Elena slip out late at night, barefoot, standing at the edge of the driveway as if she couldn't decide whether to run. Another recalled Raymond storming out in his truck, returning hours later reeking of whiskey, pounding on the door until she let him in. Detective Hughes couldn't ignore the pattern. Raymond's past painted the picture of a man who craved control, who lashed out when it slipped from his grip. If anyone was capable of pushing her to the breaking point, she told her partner, it was him. Yet the crime scene still gnawed at her. Poison, bite marks, the veil left behind. These weren't the marks of a panicked escape. They were deliberate, almost ritualistic. Meanwhile, the media had already begun shaping their narrative. Local headlines screamed, "Did the skeleton bride snap after years of abuse?" National outlets dug deeper, interviewing anyone with a story to tell about Raymond. Old girlfriends came forward, some on camera, voices shaking as they recalled his rage. He'd smile in public, one said, but at home, he was a monster. Another admitted she once thought he'd kill her if she didn't get away. The picture that emerged was damning, but incomplete. It painted Elena as a victim, but it didn't explain how a victim with barely enough strength to hold a bouquet could take down a 500-pound man. The autopsy results were still pending, but already Detective Hughes felt the scales of public opinion tipping. Raymond, once the town's imposing benefactor, was being recast as a villain. Elena, vanished into the night, was becoming a ghostly symbol of resistance or revenge, depending on who you asked. Yet Hughes, ever cautious, knew better than to take sides too soon. She pinned one of Raymond's old booking photos to her evidence board and stared at it. The grin on his face was wide, smug, confident. "Every story has two sides," she muttered under her breath. "And so far, we've only heard his." Outside her office, the courthouse clock chimed. Somewhere out there, Elena was either running for her life or savoring her escape. And back on the board, Raymond's eyes seemed to follow her, daring her to uncover the truth about what had really happened that night. Elena Marquez had always seemed like she was fading, even when she was a child. Born in 1995 to a working-class family in Ohio, she grew up lanky and pale, her health fragile, her appetite almost non-existent. Her mother would beg her to eat, piling plates with macaroni and fried chicken. But Elena would push the food around with her fork, whispering that it felt heavy in her throat. By high school, she stood taller than most boys in her class, nearly 6 feet, but weighed less than 100 pounds. Kids called her Bones, sometimes Skeleton Bride, a nickname that haunted her for years. Her medical records, later obtained by investigators, revealed years of hospital visits. At 15, she was treated for fainting spells and dangerously low blood pressure. At 19, she was admitted to a psychiatric unit after being found collapsed in a library restroom. The diagnosis, severe body dysmorphic disorder. Her therapist wrote that she was obsessed with the idea that her body should look like a walking skeleton, that flesh was something to be shed. In one chilling journal entry, she scribbled, "I want to be hollow. I want to vanish." By her 20s, Elena drifted from city to city. She worked odd jobs, cashier, housekeeper, waitress, but never stayed long. Former co-workers told detectives she was polite, even sweet, but withdrawn. She was there, but not really there, one manager said. Like her mind was somewhere else all the time. Rumors followed her too. That she had checked herself into a clinic in Florida for eating disorders, that she had been prescribed a cocktail of medications she often refused to take, that she once disappeared for 3 months only to resurface in another state with a different hair color and a new name. And yet, for all her fragility, there was a darker undertone to her story. A police report from 2018 showed she had been taken in after a neighbor found her pacing outside in the snow, barefoot, muttering that the wedding is coming. Another time, she was caught trespassing in a cemetery, dressed in a tattered white dress, carrying a wilted bouquet. When questioned, she simply told officers, "I was practicing." The phrase unsettled them, but with no crime committed, they let her go. Detective Hughes read these files with a knot in her stomach. The picture forming was not just of a victim, but of a woman teetering on the edge of obsession. Elena's fixation with weddings, with skeletal beauty, with ghostly images of herself in veils and white gowns, it seemed to foreshadow what had unfolded in room 212. And then there was the vial of powder found in her purse. Lab tests confirmed it contained sibutramine, a banned weight loss drug notorious for its dangerous side effects: rapid heartbeat, strokes, even sudden death. Elena had been using it for years, buying it illegally online. Friends from her past remembered moments that now felt prophetic. One recalled Elena staring into a mirror and saying softly, "One day, I'll walk down the aisle looking like death itself." Another claimed she once described her ideal wedding night as a ritual of release, though she never explained what that meant. A former roommate swore Elena kept a scrapbook filled with cut-out images of skeletal brides, veils stained in ink to mimic blood. Investigators found that scrapbook later, tucked inside her suitcase left behind at the hotel. But the most disturbing clue came from her psychiatric notes. One therapist had written, "Patient reports recurring vision, marrying a man who embodies flesh and weight, then destroying him to prove her purity." At the time, it was dismissed as metaphor, part of her illness. After the murder, it looked chillingly like a blueprint. Still, there was compassion in her story. Elena had been hospitalized against her will more than once, shuffled through a system that never seemed to know what to do with her. Her family, broken and exhausted, had long since lost touch. In the absence of love or stability, she drifted toward anyone who would take her in, which might explain how Raymond found her. He promised protection, stability, even indulgence. To a woman who had spent her life shrinking into invisibility, the attention of a man so physically overwhelming might have felt like destiny, or like a trap. Detective Hughes stared at a photograph of Elena from her hospital stay, her eyes wide, sunken, her lips curved into the faintest smile as she clutched a paper flower she'd made during art therapy. It was hard to reconcile that fragile woman with the one who might have strangled a man 5 times her size. Was she a victim lashing out in desperation, or a calculating figure enacting a long-nurtured fantasy? As the case spread across national headlines, the media leaned into her haunted past. Talk shows debated whether she was mentally ill, evil, or both. True crime podcasts dissected every journal entry, every eerie photograph. Some painted her as a tragic figure, a woman consumed by illness who snapped under the weight of her husband's cruelty. Others insisted she was a predator who had groomed the entire town into thinking she was too fragile to harm anyone. What no one could deny was that Elena's past left a trail of warning signs, fragments of a mind both broken and dangerous. And now, with her missing, those fragments loomed larger than ever. Somewhere out, there was a woman who once called herself the Skeleton Bride. Whether she was running in fear or savoring her freedom, no one knew. But every detail of her history suggested that whatever role she played in the death of Raymond Langley, it had been written long before the wedding bells rang. Detective Carla Hughes had worked enough homicide scenes to know when something didn't add up, and Room 212 was one of those cases. The physical evidence was contradictory, like 2 different crimes had been layered on top of each other. On the one hand, the autopsy confirmed what Dr. Lane had suspected. Raymond Langley's airway had been obstructed, consistent with strangulation. On the other hand, his blood work revealed something far stranger: traces of sibutramine, the same banned weight loss drug found in Elena's purse. Alone, the drug might have triggered heart failure in a man of Raymond's size. Together with the strangulation marks, it suggested a deliberate attack. The forensic team combed through the room again, uncovering details missed in the chaos of that first night. A broken chair leg was smeared with blood, likely from Raymond's nose when he fell. Fibers from a white gown were embedded in the carpet near the bed, as if someone had been dragged or had wrestled violently there. And tucked under the nightstand, barely visible, was a set of black leather gloves, their linings soaked with sweat. DNA swabs were still pending, but Detective Hughes already suspected whose they were. The toxicology results deepened the mystery. Raymond's system contained not just sibutramine, but a sedative possibly slipped into the champagne. If Elena had planned it, she'd chosen her tools carefully: poison to weaken him, sedative to dull his reflexes, and a ligature to finish the job. But why leave so much behind? Why abandon her purse, her veil, her gloves, like breadcrumbs leading straight to her guilt? Meanwhile, the town buzzed with sightings. At 3:30 a.m., a truck driver swore he saw a tall, thin woman walking along Route 9, barefoot, her dress trailing in the dirt. At 4 o'clock, a gas station clerk reported a woman matching Elena's description buying bottled water with damp, trembling hands. Neither sighting was confirmed by cameras, but the timing lined up with the footage from the hotel hallway. It was enough to keep the investigation alive, though the leads always seemed to dissolve into mist. Detective Hughes pressed harder. She ordered a sweep of Raymond's rental properties, hoping Elena might be hiding there. At one unit, investigators found something chilling. A room locked from the outside, the windows boarded, the mattress stained. Neighbors admitted they'd sometimes heard women crying inside, but assumed it was tenants fighting. Hughes couldn't shake the thought. Had Raymond intended to keep Elena there after the wedding? Was the marriage less about love and more about control, even captivity? If Elena had discovered the truth, it might explain her sudden eruption of violence. Yet the case refused to settle neatly into victim and monster. A diary pulled from Elena's belongings complicated the picture. In shaky handwriting, she wrote about becoming lighter than bone, about a ceremony of release that would end in blood. Some entries sounded like delusions, others like planning. One passage, dated weeks before the wedding, read, "He thinks he owns me. On our night, I will prove him wrong." For Hughes, it was damning. For Elena's supporters, it was simply the ramblings of a woman lost in mental illness. The manhunt grew more desperate. Posters of Elena's gaunt face appeared at gas stations and diners. Talk shows labeled her the skeleton bride. Podcasters speculated whether she was dead already, wandering like a ghost, or alive and calculating her next move. Social media split into two camps: hashtag Justice for Elena and hashtag Bride Killer. Every new lead brought cameras, reporters, and pressure. Then came the breakthrough. Surveillance footage from a cemetery on the edge of town, grainy, black and white, captured a figure moving between the headstones at dawn. Tall, thin, wearing what looked like a shredded gown. The timestamp, 5:42 a.m., only hours after Raymond's death. Detectives raced to the scene, scouring the grounds. They found wilted flowers scattered near a crypt, as if someone had carried them and dropped them in haste. On the grass, a footprint pressed deep into the mud matched Elena's shoe size exactly. Forensic experts argued over the symbolism. Was Elena returning to the cemetery because of her obsession with death and weddings? Or had she fled there in shock, seeking refuge among the dead? To Detective Hughes, the act felt intentional, almost theatrical. It was as if Elena wanted to be seen, to transform her disappearance into legend. Dr. Lane's final autopsy report sealed the medical findings. Raymond's heart had been compromised by the drug, his airway crushed by a strap or cord. Death was ruled a homicide. Combined with the bite marks on his shoulder, marks that matched Elena's dental records, the case seemed airtight. But when Hughes presented the file to the district attorney, the question remained: how could a woman so frail execute such a violent act alone? That question haunted Hughes as she replayed the hallway footage again. Elena stumbling, clutching the wall, her gown dragging. The image was eerie, but something else caught her eye this time. The faintest shadow behind Elena, a blur at the edge of the frame. It could have been a camera glitch, Or it could have been another figure, unseen in the chaos of that night. If there had been someone else in room 212, the entire case would change. Elena might not have been a killer, but an accomplice, or even a pawn. For Hughes, it was the first crack in the narrative that had consumed the town. The skeleton bride might not have been acting alone. And if that were true, then the real killer could still be out there, hidden in plain sight. As she closed her file for the night, Hughes glanced at the veil sealed in its evidence bag. The lace was stiff, the blood dried into rust-colored blotches. It was the most haunting piece of the puzzle, left behind like a signature. And she couldn't shake the feeling that Elena had left it on purpose, not just as a clue, but as a challenge. Detective Carla Hughes had been convinced she was closing in on Elena, but the deeper she dug, the more the ground shifted beneath her. The evidence pointed to the bride, her fingerprints on the champagne glass, her DNA in the bite marks on Raymond's shoulder, the vial of poison in her purse. It all screamed guilt. Yet every time Hughes tried to fit the puzzle together, there was a missing piece, something that made the picture blur. And then the case took a turn no one expected. A cab driver came forward. His name was Luis Ramirez, and he'd been working the night shift when he picked up a fare just after 3:30 a.m. A woman, tall and rail-thin, stumbled into his back seat near the intersection by the hotel. Her white gown was ripped, streaked with blood, and her eyes darted wildly in the mirror. "She wouldn't look at me," Ramirez told police. "She just whispered, over and over, 'He'll never touch me again. He'll never touch me again.'" Ramirez swore he dropped her at the edge of town near the old steel bridge, where she vanished into the dark. The testimony rattled Hughes. This wasn't the behavior of a triumphant killer reveling in her freedom. It sounded like the voice of someone broken, terrified. Yet at the same time, Ramirez's statement confirmed Elena had been covered in blood. The contradiction gnawed at Hughes until another revelation emerged. Lab results from the gloves found under the nightstand came back. DNA from both Raymond and Elena, as expected, but also something else. A third profile, unidentified. That faint shadow in the hallway footage suddenly mattered more. If another person had been in room 212, then Elena might not have been alone in what happened to Raymond. She might not have been a mastermind at all. Digging into Raymond's phone records, Hughes found a series of late-night texts to a number registered under an alias. The messages were chilling. "She's fragile. Easy to break. After the vows, she'll belong to me." But one message stood out, sent just hours before the wedding. "Meet me at the cabin after. She won't be a problem." Whoever was on the other end was no stranger. It hinted at a side arrangement, a secret plan. Investigators tracked the number to a prepaid burner phone, purchased with cash. Dead end, or so it seemed, until a forensic sweep uncovered the phone's last ping near the hotel the night of the murder. It wasn't just Elena and Raymond in that room. Someone else had been close enough to touch the walls. Meanwhile, Dr. Lane revealed another unsettling detail from the autopsy. The ligature marks around Raymond's neck were deeper on one side than the other, angled as if pulled by more than one hand. A frail woman weighing 88 pounds could never have tightened that strap with such force. But two people could. Hughes couldn't shake the feeling that Elena's diary, once seen as the ramblings of a disturbed mind, might hold a hidden meaning. One line, written weeks before the wedding, leapt out at her now. "He thinks he's in control, but shadows will finish what I start." Was Elena hinting at an accomplice? Or was she delusional, writing fantasies that someone else exploited? The twist sent shockwaves through the investigation. Some in the department argued Elena had recruited help, that she'd lured someone into her plan of revenge. Others believed the opposite, that Elena was being manipulated, her illness weaponized by another figure in Raymond's orbit. When Hughes presented her findings to the DA, she warned, "If we go after her alone, we might be letting the real killer walk free." The town didn't want to hear it. To them, the story was simple and seductive. The skeleton bride had murdered her giant groom. It was a headline that sold papers, boosted ratings, kept the story alive. But Hughes refused to let the easy answer stand. She pushed for background checks on Raymond's associates, on the women he'd dated, even on his family. That's when she stumbled onto something darker. One of Raymond's ex-girlfriends, Marla Jennings, the same woman who once accused him of violence, had gone missing 3 years earlier. Her case was closed as a runaway, but Hughes found inconsistencies, credit cards left and used, belongings abandoned. And in Raymond's rental property, in a locked room they'd discovered earlier, fibers matched the sweater Marla had been wearing the last day she was seen. Suddenly, the possibility of other victims came into play. If Raymond had a history of trapping women, then Elena's so-called breakdown might have been survival. And if someone helped her that night, maybe it wasn't about revenge at all, but about escape. But the story refused to settle neatly. Days after Ramirez's testimony, another video surfaced. Security footage from a gas station outside town showed Elena, or a woman like her, stumbling inside at 4:10 a.m. She bought bottled water, her hands trembling, her eyes hollow. But behind her, blurred in the reflection of the cooler door, was a figure waiting by the pumps. Tall, hooded, face obscured. Hughes replayed the clip over and over, her gut tightening. Whoever that was, they weren't random. They were following her, watching her, maybe guiding her steps. The case that had once seemed so straightforward was unraveling into something stranger, more sinister. Elena wasn't just a suspect anymore. She was a cipher, a woman whose illness and obsession had made her both dangerous and vulnerable. And somewhere in the shadows, another player was moving pieces on the board. For Hughes, one truth became clear. The skeleton bride hadn't acted alone. Whether she was victim, conspirator, or both, the real story of that wedding night was still buried in secrets. And until the shadow and the footage had a name, the case would remain wide open. The story of the skeleton bride refused to fade, even as the weeks turned into months. Room 212 was scrubbed, repainted, and eventually rented again, but locals swore they could still smell iron in the air, still hear a woman's faint sobs through the walls at night. The hotel itself became a roadside curiosity. Tourists drove in just to stand outside the yellow brick building where a 500-pound groom met his end and his ghostly bride disappeared into legend. Detective Carla Hughes never closed the file. She couldn't. Too many threads dangled loose. Too many questions gnawed at her. The bite marks, the poison, the gloves with the third DNA profile, all of it pointed to something more complex than a frail woman snapping on her wedding night. Yet without Elena, there was no way to test the theories, no way to confirm if she was victim or villain, pawn or mastermind. The town clung to its own versions of the story. In church basements and diners, people debated late into the night. Some insisted Elena had been a prisoner in her marriage, finally striking back in a moment of savage survival. Others saw her as a calculating predator, a woman who had lured Raymond into marriage just to destroy him. A few whispered about a shadowy accomplice, someone who'd slipped in and out of the room unseen, leaving Elena to carry both the blame and the myth. National media turned the case into spectacle. Talk shows hosted panels of psychologists who argued about Elena's mental health. One described her as a tragic figure consumed by body dysmorphia. Another painted her as a manipulator who weaponized her fragility. True crime podcasts dissected every diary entry, every photograph, spinning theories about cult connections, ritual killings, even supernatural curses. On social media, hashtags trended for weeks. Hashtag Justice for Elena versus hashtag Bride Killer. Each side attacking the other with memes, think pieces, and endless speculation. And then came the sightings. A farmer claimed he saw her walking along a dirt road at dusk, her gown torn, her eyes hollow. A group of teenagers swore they encountered a woman in white drifting among the gravestones at the old cemetery, her veil shredded, her skin pale as bone. Truckers passing through late at night reported glimpses of a figure on the highway shoulder, tall and skeletal, vanishing into the fog before they could stop. Police investigated, but each lead dissolved into nothing, leaving behind only more whispers. Hughes tried to stay grounded in facts. The third DNA profile was entered into national databases, but no match came back. The cab driver's testimony remained credible, but uncorroborated. The gas station footage was too grainy to confirm the hooded figure's identity. The evidence refused to settle, like a puzzle missing its final corner piece. Late at night, Hughes would sit in her office, staring at the blood-stained veil sealed in its evidence bag. To her, it felt less like a clue and more like a taunt, a reminder that the truth was still out there, mocking her. For Raymond's family, there was no closure either. His sister insisted on his innocence, portraying him as a generous man who had been seduced and destroyed by a disturbed woman. His ex-girlfriends, emboldened by the spotlight, painted the opposite picture, describing years of fear and abuse. The truth of who he was, villain or victim himself, became as contested as Elena's role in his death. The legend grew with each retelling. In bars, the story was exaggerated into gothic folklore. The giant Groom crushed to death by a skeletal bride, her ghost roaming the highways in blood-stained lace. Children dared each other to sneak into the cemetery at night and call her name. Tour guides in nearby towns began adding the skeleton bride to their roster of local ghost stories, her myth blurring with the reality of an unsolved crime. Detective Hughes, though, knew better than to dismiss it as just a tale. She carried the weight of the case like a stone in her chest. In her gut, she believed Elena was still alive somewhere, maybe hiding, maybe planning, maybe simply lost. Whether she was innocent, guilty, or both no longer seemed like a clean question. In Hughes's darker moments, she wondered if Elena had become exactly what she had always wanted to be, a skeleton bride, untouchable, existing only in shadows, belonging to no one. The file remained open, the ending unwritten. Some nights Hughes would imagine catching sight of a tall, thin woman at the edge of her headlights, pale dress fluttering in the wind, vanishing before she could blink. Other nights she would imagine the hooded figure, the accomplice who had never been named, still out there, smiling at the chaos left behind. And so the case lived on, not in courtrooms, but in whispers, in rumors, in the uneasy silence that fell whenever wedding bells rang in that small town. Was Elena a victim pushed to the brink, a killer who orchestrated her husband's death, or a ghost walking forever between those two truths? No one knew for sure. What everyone did know was that the skeleton bride had become more than a woman. She was a question that would never be answered, a story that would haunt anyone who'd ever heard it. And as long as people gathered in that town, as long as they looked toward the fated hotel and remembered the night when vows turned to violence, the name Elena Marquez would linger, an echo of lace and blood, a shadow that refused to die.